Hey guys, I am Sharath from Sharath the Geek and welcome to this video on camera basics. In this video I'm going to talk about the different aspects of a camera, the basics of a camera, the fundamentals of the camera. There are several parameters that decide the quality of the photo. A camera consists of two different segments, the lens and the body. The lens helps to acquire light from the surroundings and it projects it onto the sensor. The sensor is inside the body. The body has different circuit control boards that help in transforming, or you can say processing, the light from the sensor to a digital image. That's what you see when you look at the viewfinder. A good photo is as a result of good exposure. The amount of light that enters the camera decides predominantly the quality of the photo. If there is a lack of light, the image is called underexposed. If there is over-availability of light, the image is called overexposed. You have to find that medium level. And for that to happen, you need to know the basics of photography. Exposure that enters the camera is decided by three parameters, basically: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. These three parameters are together known by the name exposure triangle. These three triangles decide the exposure that a photo has. Now let me explain the three different parameters in detail. Aperture. Aperture is actually the size of the pupil of the lens. In the human eye, you might have noticed that your eye has a pupil. In bright light, the pupil dilates. In dim light, the pupil expands. It's automatic. In a camera also, these processes have to take place. When you set your camera in auto mode, that is, your camera sets all the settings, the aperture changes in dim light and bright light according to situation. But in a manual mode, you have to control the aperture. So let me give an idea about aperture. From the definition of human eye, I have to say, more the aperture, more amount of light enters the camera, and less of the aperture, lower the amount of light enters the camera. Now, aperture is measured by using the unit f-stop, f being the abbreviation for focal stop. You might have noticed f3.6, which in cameras and lenses, 3.6, 1.7. So what's its significance? So a higher aperture denotes a smaller f-stop. So for a higher aperture, it might be f1.7. And for a lower aperture, it might be higher f3.8 or something like that. You might have noticed in this thing. So a lower aperture means a bigger pupil. A higher aperture means a lower pupil. Now, what's the significance of this thing? As I told you before, a lower aperture allows less light to enter. That means less exposure. A higher aperture introduces more light. That means more exposure. And that increases the quality of the photo. Another thing that aperture plays a vital role is in the depth of field. It's a prominent effect that modern photographers use all the time. So you might have noticed that blurry background behind the subject. That's depth of field. Higher aperture makes more depth of field, more blurriness, whereas a smaller aperture makes less blurriness. The next parameter in our exposure triangle is a shutter speed. Shutter speed is a time taken for the camera's shutter to close. It's measured in seconds and often ranges between 1/250th, 1/3000, 1 second, 2 seconds exactly. Now, this has a substantial influence in the amount of light that enters the camera. Consider this example. If the shutter closes very fast, less light enters the camera. If it closes very slowly, more light enters the camera. And this settings is quite useful for taking fast-moving shots. For example, when an object moves, and if you have a lower shutter speed, you can grasp that object. The resultant disadvantage is the fact that low light enters it because it's actually closing for a bit of time. Now, coming to a higher shutter speed, that means it takes more time to close the shutter. That means more light enters the camera, more exposure. And this is actually used for taking a still shot, but for a long period of time. For example, you can take a shot of water falling from a waterfall. That's where it's used. That's the usage of shutter speed. Another parameter to be considered is ISO. ISO is the sensitivity of the camera. ISO, the full form, is actually International Standard Organization. It determines the sensitivity of the sensor. How sensitive our sensor is to light. If the sensor increases its sensitivity, more light is expressed. If the sensor decreases sensitivity, that's lower ISO, less light is expressed. Now, there is a con. For higher ISO, the problem is that more noise is induced in the image. Image noise is actually unwanted pixels as a result of oversensitivity of the sensor. If you use lower ISO, less exposure, that means low quality photo, bad photo. And you have to choose a right ISO in this particular thing. So that's my explanation for the exposure triangle. If you can use these three parameters carefully and in the right way, you can take some good photo. Absolutely brilliant photo. Now, how do we get that right sense of photo? Right sense of parameter control? That's through experience and practice. To become an avid photographer, you need to have extensive practice. After you get a hold on these parameters, you become an avid photographer. So basically, what I'm trying to say is a simple fact. To get the greatest of photos, you have to control the amount of light that enters a camera. And to control the amount of light that enters a camera, we have three different parameters: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Shutter speed and aperture are the two important parameters that decide the amount of light enters. Aperture is the opening of the lens. Shutter speed is actually the amount of time taken for the shutter to close. So if you are able to control these three parameters in an amazing way, you have taken a good photo. Kudos, you are an amazing photographer. So thank you for watching this video. And it's actually a long video, I suppose. And if you like such videos on my channel, please do subscribe onto my channel at ShutterSpeed. That's what I have to say. Thank you so much for watching.